Hello, APE students. Mr. Harrison here for our second video having to do with Unit 2, Biodiversity. Before I get started, I want to tell you yesterday I was actually last week, I was in a meeting where we were supposed to say where we would go if we could go anywhere in the world free of charge. And I immediately thought of the Galapagos Islands, which are off here, the coast of Ecuador. And why is that? Is because I think it'd be an amazing place to examine biodiversity and evolution. There's lots of very unique species you can only find in the Galapagos, like this iguana that eats algae off rocks, a series of finches that inspired Darwin's theory of evolution, giant tortoises, and all these species have developed and evolved in an area with lots of ecological disturbance caused by volcanoes, caused by storms, and they have persevered and evolved very unique characteristics. And I think that'd be really fascinating. So what does this have to do with what we're learning about? Well, today we're going to be learning about the theory of island biogeography. We're also going to learn about what is called ecological tolerance and natural disruptions. I do this through lecture, but also we'll be embedding some FRQ questions in the Ed puzzle. And why we're doing this is, as you know, biodiversity is a principle of sustainability, and we need to continue to work on our FRQ skills. So to begin with, what is the theory of island biogeography? So first off, our learning objective is to describe what this is, mainly focusing on our skill of concept explanation. You can see our essential knowledge. I want to point out this last one. We're going to be talking about invasive species later on. You might have some in your iNaturalist spot. Just know that islands are places where there's lots of specialist species, those ones that only live in a certain habitat, certain condition, and those species are very susceptible to disturbance and invasive species. So we'll be talking about that later. So, study of ecological relationships and community structures on islands. That's what island biogeography. So you can kind of break down the word biogeography. Islands can be actual islands, so out in the ocean like the Galapagos, but they can also be figurative islands or habitats that are isolated, like New York City's Central Park, if you've ever been there. An oasis in the middle of a big, huge urban area, very isolated from other forest ecosystems. And so probably those species are isolated like they would be if they were on an island. You might have one in your iNaturalist spot. And if you have a little park that's surrounded by urban areas, that could also be considered an island. Two basic rules to remember. Number one is larger islands have more species. We're going to talk about why. Mainly the larger the island, the more ecosystem diversity. Remember back to what is biodiversity? Ecosystem diversity is one of those characteristics. Greater ecosystem diversity means more habitat and food resources, more available niches that organisms can play in that ecosystem. Islands also closer to the mainland support more species, and that's because it's easier to get there, colonize from the mainland. More colonizing organisms means more genetic diversity. Remember back to diversity, the three types: ecosystem, species, and genetics. Here's a diagram we're going to be talking about here, having to do with number of species and different islands. Larger islands, again, more ecosystem diversity. You can kind of see that visually in this diagram of the Galapagos Islands. These are habitat zones. And you can, if you've ever been to a mountainous part of the United States, You've probably experienced this where you start down the bottom and you work your way up, and things change. Really dramatic in the Southwest. If you go places like Arizona and New Mexico, you can start in desert and end in alpine as you work up in elevation. So in the case of the Galapagos Islands, these different zones provide different food sources for different species. Larger population sizes can also exist on these larger islands, more genetic diversity, more resistance to environmental disturbances. These islands, especially the Galapagos, probably have had times where volcanoes have killed all the species, and then they had to kind of start over almost. A huge disturbance like that, or a major storm wiping out half the species of plants on that particular island, and they had to kind of start over. So the more species they have, the more likely there are to survive that. Lower extinction rates. So a larger island is going to have less likely to have species go extinct. And you can see this in the Caribbean islands, another place if you've ever been. I haven't. I'd love to go. And you can see Cuba is the largest island, and it has the largest number of species. Versus down here, Rhodesia is the smallest island. Never even heard of that one. And it is has the least amount of species. So also the distance. So the closer an island is, that means more species can fly there, they can swim there. In case of lizards, they can actually be transported by these rafts of vegetation. Here you can see this diagram, mainland having all these different species, and a lot easier for them to get to this island A, all these species, versus this one way out here by island C. As these species kind of hop or leapfrog their way to the island, not all of them are going to make it there. So the closer you are to the mainland, the more diversity in the case of island biogeography. Okay, go to this. So one thing also to recognize with islands is islands are a place where a lot of evolution happens, unique characteristics. That's one reason that the Galapagos are so fundamental to Charles Darwin's theory. Lots of pressure for species to adapt, and they tend to adapt very narrow niches. Again, resource partitioning. Term it's very important to know is adaptive radiation. So in the case of the finches of the Galapagos, one individual species, the common ancestor that came from South America, probably Ecuador, radiated into all these different types of finches. And Darwin didn't know what they were. He actually took samples and brought it back to England. And it wasn't until another ornithologist looked at them and said, hey, these are all finches, where he started to think, I wonder if they all came from this common ancestor. And we know now genetically that this is the phylogenetic tree of these finches. And they're evolving to eat different things. You can see there's ground finches, tree finches, and then ones that eat insects. And their bills, their beaks are all going to be adapted to eat those different food sources in those different habitat zones. Okay, so what I'd like you to do now is this practice FRQ, describe the process of colonizing an island habitat, and describe how islands' distance from the mainland influences the number of species that will colonize the habitat, island habitat. And again, the skill is concept explanation. All right, ecological tolerance, our next topic, 2.4. So what we're going to be working on today is describing ecological tolerance, and our skill is text analysis. This is something that can show up in an FRQ. It could also show up in a multiple choice question on the AP exam. They have started to incorporate in the last year some reading comprehension type questions. Essential knowledge, ecological tolerance refers to the range of conditions in which, such as temperature, salinity, flow rate, and sunlight, that an organism can endure before injury or death. Ecological tolerance can apply to individuals and to species. And we're going to be talking about it mainly in terms of how adaptable are species to different types of disturbances. So, range of conditions. This can include temperature, salinity, pH, sunlight that organism can endure. Um, all species have a particular range of tolerance for different conditions, abiotic conditions. Some are more tolerant, obviously, than others. For example, salmon, which I worked as a fisheries biologist out in Northern California with mainly Chinook and coho salmon. And their species live out in the ocean. They come up to streams to survive, to breed. And these salmon have a basic range of tolerance specific to temperature from 6 degrees to 22 degrees Celsius. But obviously, some salmon might have adaptations that give them a range of tolerance that is outside of that basic range, that species, due to genetic diversity. And that's going to make those populations more resistant to disturbances or to things like global warming. And this is where it's really concerning with some of those populations of salmon where they're very small. And some of the ones in Northern California, the populations of those particular species don't have a lot of genetic diversity. So they are more susceptible to things like climate change. All right, so this is a graph that you should learn. Let me get a drink. My zone of tolerance, I'm outside of my range of tolerance right now of water. Much better. A good way to think about this is I like to think about Goldilocks, the story of Goldilocks and the three bears. Preferred niche is kind of where things are just right. And maximum amount of individuals of organisms can survive there. So let's think of maybe it's temperature, water temperature, and we have fish. And those fish have that ideal range where they can survive. You get outside of that range, and maybe you've had fish tanks, and it's really important to have heaters for tropical species. But if you forget to turn your heater on or something, maybe your heater is going to make your temperature is going to drop into a spot where it's going to start stressing those fish out. Those fish will demonstrate that in their behavior. And then it'll get so cold that those tropical fish will start floating to the surface. And obviously the same thing can happen on the other end. Here's a couple examples. pH is also demonstrated there. And this is really, I would say zone of tolerance is oftentimes used to describe aquatic ecosystems, I would say, more so than not aquatic. Anyone could email me a species of macroinvertebrate, if you look that up, that has a very narrow range of tolerance for either temperature or dissolved oxygen. First one does that, we'll get extra credit. Okay, so the optimal range where organisms survive, grow, and reproduce. So zone of physiological stress, that's where those species are going to start having difficulty. It could be difficulty in just survival or in reproduction or growth and activity. Zone of intolerance, that's usually when organisms die. They're living beyond what they can survive in. They're not living in that area. Okay, when you write FRQs, a good tip, pro tip, is when you think about human activities that might influence or disturb a habitat, connect it to ecological range of tolerance. So an example, I'm going to talk about climate change. So imagine we're talking about climate change, and the question has to do with that. You would be describing how things like generating electricity, transportation are all going to release carbon dioxide, which is going to heat up the earth. As global shifts of temperature might make it very difficult for something like a tree species, causing their populations to decline. It could be it changes their ability to do photosynthesis or to produce flowers or Lots of those ecological processes are really important to that species. Or you could say something that it shifts global warming of the ocean, for example, can shift the temperature outside the range of tolerance for many fish species, causing die-offs. Another classic example are coral reefs. Unlike fish, corals can't move to get away from an abiotic condition that's outside of the range of tolerance. So oftentimes they will go through bleaching if they are stressed. And we're going to be talking about that process, either caused by increased warm temperatures of the ocean caused by climate change, or directly the carbon dioxide can acidify the ocean. And that's also a stressor to coral reefs. So try to connect that shift to tolerance to a specific physiological stress, such as suffocation, thermoshock, water, food, or nutrients. Here's an example. Global warming. The ocean shifts temperature outside the range of many fish. Since global warming increases ocean temperature and warm water holds less oxygen, and this is a true fact, fish may suffocate due to lack of oxygen. Global warming can also increase droughts. With increased droughts, rainfall patterns may shift outside the range of tolerance for many plants. Without enough rainfall, these species may suffer declines, and as the roots are unable to absorb enough water from the soil. All right, here's a practice, a text analysis question I'd like you to do, having to do with salmon. Go. All right, 2.5, our last topic for today, natural disruptions to ecosystems. Here you can see our learning target is to explain how different disruptions, both short and long-term, impact ecosystems. We have this essential knowledge we're going to be talking about, having to do with, and this is again, natural disruptions to ecosystems. The skill we're going to work on here today is data analysis. I'm going to give you a data set and see if you can analyze it. All right, I'm just going to jump to this. So natural disturbance is a natural event that disrupts the structure and function of an ecosystem. It could be something like a tornado, hurricanes, which are all over the news right now, asteroids, forest fires. We've had plenty of those. They can be sometimes in case even greater than human disruptions, right? A large meteor like the one that hit the Yucatan 65, 67 million years ago would be pretty hard for even humans to replicate in terms of its impact on the Earth. So disruptions can be pretty massive. They can be periodic. They can be episodic, meaning they only happen kind of once, or they have episodal events, or they can be fairly random in when they happen. Examples of periodic would be things like droughts, wet seasons. Episodic, those are irregular, things like hurricanes, droughts that are unpredicted, and fires. Random, there's really no regular frequency, volcanoes, earthquakes, and asteroids. These that we can model effectively. Sometimes geologists are able to model make predictions on probabilities on volcanoes and earthquakes, but can't really predict exactly when they're going to happen. Natural climate change, very important to recognize before we talk about anthropogenic climate change, which is human caused. We know the Earth has varied over geological time for lots of reasons. The Earth's orbit and the tilt has caused many ice ages, and we know warming events have occurred. We can also look at data like carbon dioxide levels trapped in air bubbles and correlate that to temperature. And this is a lot of the science that kind of supports anthropogenic climate change, is that we know that there is a direct correlation between CO2 and temperature, and we can look back nearly a million years to see that relationship. All right. Sea levels. We know sea levels have varied a lot over geological time as the Earth as the Earth was in ice age periods, that water, the ocean was locked up in the sea ice. And as warmth happened periodically, those melting glaciers caused the sea level to rise. And you can see here some data having to do with sea level over periods of time, either higher than normal or lower than normal. Increased carbon dioxide, we know, has led to warmer temperatures, melting of glacial ice, and causing that sea level to rise. So CO2, we know, is directly correlated, again, to temperature, which is related to sea level rising from melting glaciers. Okay, so when the environmental change happens, there is a habitat disruption. Major environmental disturbances can cause widespread habitat change or loss. Sea levels, for example, we know as sea levels rise, they can inundate or flood coastal areas and basically eliminate some ecosystems, such as see the salt marsh and mangrove swamps, almost completely eliminate them, kind of push them up to the range where they're now right on the roads. There's no place to go. It can really cause a significant loss of that ecosystem. Here we've got current and future projections. If we look at climate change, what could happen? And you can see as these sea levels rising, what they're going to be doing to changing that intertidal zone and all the way up into those mangrove swamps and beyond in the terrestrial ecosystem. So how do species deal with disturbance? We know wildlife can migrate to new habitat. We know wildebeest, for example, are adapted to dealing with drought and adapted to dealing with dry and wet seasons. And they can follow those rain patterns that produce the grass they can eat. We know that ocean species can move further north as water temperature warms. Birds can migrate and breed shifting earlier as insect hatch occur. So we have starting to see some changes. And this whole science is called phenology, the seasonal or the science of studying of the seasons and looking for signs of the seasons. And what we know now is that, for example, insects in this case are en masse in certain places. This is probably based on East Coast, I would imagine, somewhere on the East Coast, eastern forests, that the peak biomass of important caterpillars for birds is earlier now than it used to be. And so what does that mean? That birds probably need to start timing their breeding earlier, because those insects are very important to fledglings. So how do you get a bird from an egg to an adult? You really need a lot of protein. So there has to be a shift in those species, and they have to have the genetic diversity to do so, and the behavioral diversity to be able to do that. All right, FRQ question. Describe the relationship between latitude and change in first leaf date depicted in this graph. Explain why you think this relationship exists. I'm going to be including a link for you to look at for this resource, from this resource. And you can take a look at that in detail and answer your question. And this is a data analysis question. So that concludes our 3 topics for today. Good luck on your FRQs. See ya.